Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. You may or may not be aware, but last year in November, we tried in vain to get Leisl to come and give this very talk, but a freak November snowstorm canceled all flights in and out of Chicago, and she was stranded in Iowa. So we're excited that we were able to finally get her to make it out here. Professor Leisl Carr Childers is an assistant professor of history at Northern Iowa University. She earned her bachelor's and her master's from Pepperdine in California, and then her PhD from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She has been associated with the Red Center for almost a decade. I looked back, and it turns out that we helped fund some of her early research back in the summer of 2007. So that's a good decade that we've been working with her. She's the author of a number of journal articles, book chapters, book reviews. She's an active public historian, both in Iowa and here in the Great Basin, the Intermountain West. She's a primary contributor to a really great, mostly 20th century Western blog called Blog West, which if you're interested in Western environmental topics, is a good place to go. It is also of note that she spent much of her formative years here in the Intermountain West, the best of which I can only assume were when she went to junior high in Layton, Utah, up in Davis County, which I'm sure is the highlight of her schooling. Most recently and significantly, she's the author of the book The Size of Risk: Histories and Multiple Use in the Great Basin. And this is going to be the basis for her talk today. It was published in 2015 by the University of Oklahoma Press. And as you listen, I think you'll see it's a timely book on a pressing and important topic that here in the Intermountain West. So let's welcome Dr. Childers.
Well, thank you for inviting me to the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies to speak about my research and current book, The Size of the Risk: Histories of Multiple Use in the Great Basin. It's true, I did live in Layton for 4 years. It's true that I went to Central Davis Junior High, and it's also true that some of the best years of my childhood were spent in Utah on the Wasatch Front. So that was no lie, Brendan, that was no lie. So despite the fact that I've actually lived and traveled all over the American West, I've always felt this region that emerges from the western foot of the Wasatch Front to be my home. My sentiments are exactly the opposite of most people that traverse the Great Basin. On I-15 or I-80, on highways 6, 50, 91, 93, and 89, and all the dirt roads in between. I actually love this landscape. Why I love it? Something about the sagebrush sea, the aridity, the color of the sky, the color of the mountains, and the way the entire landscape undulates, in John McPhee's words, as basin and range and basin and range. I am grateful to the Charles Redd Center for helping fund my book project through research back in 2007. And as, well, let's just say that they paid for the maps through a publisher's subvention, which I'm also grateful for. And if it weren't for organizations like the Redd Center, because without their support, Western historians like myself are not able to accomplish the work we want to accomplish. So funding sources and the support that the Redd Center gives are absolutely essential. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about how my work came to be. Between 2005 and 2008 at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, I was the assistant director of the Nevada Test Site Oral History Project, an endeavor meant to capture the experiences of those who worked on or were affected by nuclear testing. And if you didn't know, the Nevada Test Site, located just 60 miles north of Las Vegas, is the area where we conducted most of our continental nuclear tests. My role on the NTSOHP was to manage the collection. That's a lot of paperwork. We have somewhere around 150 interviews, interview transcripts, 330 hours, or 335 hours, give or take, of oral history interviews, and I got to process all of them. So I got to know the history of nuclear testing quite well. But my other role was to do some interviews, particularly with people that other students, other graduate students, and other faculty participating in the project didn't want to do. Turns out nobody wanted to drive into the middle of the Great Basin and talk to ranchers. And being that I come from rural places, that was exactly what I wanted to do. So I took my Ford Explorer and womped it all over those dirt roads in the middle of the area between Tonopah and Ely and Las Vegas. And if you've never been out in that region, it's great. You should do it sometime, but bring a spare tire, and there's no cell phone service, just for the record. So I began my conversation with a rancher. This was my first interview, a guy named Grazing Act, who was a third-generation Basque rancher. And he talked about a lot of things. I should clarify where he lives. He is actually located in a place called Garden Valley, off of Seaman Wash Road. You have to go through Coal Valley before you get to Garden Valley. You have to, I'm trying to remember his instructions, you turn at mile marker 16, and then you end up crossing through a wash, going through a gate to make sure you shut the gate, follow Cherry Creek to a place called Adovin, which is Nevada spelled backwards. None of this is signed, by the way. There are no street signs. And like I said, there's no cell service, so it's not like you can pull up a map. So I ended up with a paper map in my hand and praying that I didn't hit any nails because my jack on my car wasn't really working very well. And working my way through that area to find his ranch. So it was a little bit of an adventure. As I'm talking to him, and this is his ranch house actually. As I'm talking to him, and this is a December morning that's actually quite warm, I realize that the things that he's telling me don't actually make any sense from where I sit in Las Vegas. That I'm asking him about nuclear testing, and he's telling me a lot more about some other things. And at the time of the interview, I didn't fully appreciate what it was that he was doing. But he said something at the very end of the interview. He said, I think we're at a crossroads where you know this way of life. I guess I see it fading out to a certain extent. I think if you want to, and you're hungry enough to hang on to it, there may be a chance. And I actually had no idea what he meant. I had no idea. I assumed in some ways he meant ranching, because I know he told me about his struggles with ranching, but he may have meant something else. And so this was of great enough interest to me that I actually started molding my research project, my dissertation project, on that question, understanding what this particular phrase meant. Through the course of the interview, he talked about Mustangs. This is a famous photograph that Gus Bundy took that was publicized by a woman named Velma Johnston, who was the architect of the wild horse movement. But when Grazing talked about Mustangs, he talked about it this way. He said, I grew up chasing Mustangs, but I mean my dad, boy, if you saw a bunch of horses, forget the cows or anything else, away you went chasing Mustangs. I've been on that damn commission, the Nevada Wild Horse Commission, for 10 years, and I just hate to see Nevada's resources getting depleted. As far as the Washington office of the BLM horse deal, I don't think they care to solve the problem. He also talked about mushroom clouds, talked about his experiences with nuclear testing. He said, as a little kid, I can remember people coming around, and they made us wear these badges that I didn't know what it was for. I didn't understand how something that you couldn't see could hurt you. But when they shot off the Sedan crater, and it looked like it was snowing here, I think I had nightmares and everything after that because that kind of brought it home. And he's speaking about radioactive fallout. The intersection of Mustangs and mushroom clouds was very interesting in this conversation. And that intersection has a lot to do with this passing way of life that he's talking about. So to get to the bottom of this particular troublesome statement and to sort of tease out the connection between Mustangs and mushroom clouds, one of the things I had to do was look at the land that Gracie and Uhalde lived on and the land that he was using. This land is public land, and as you know, the Great Basin, this includes the western section of Utah and the vast majority of Nevada, but particularly the eastern section of Nevada. All of it is comprised of public lands, by and large, a good 90% of that region. Nevada, statistically, is around 87%. Utah is a little less, but that central area combined runs well over 90%. That means the federal government manages that land. The federal government is responsible for the management of all the land not held privately or overseen by state, county, or local governments. So who manages it? These are the federal agencies that manage that land: the Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Department of Agriculture through the Forest Service, Department of Defense, Department of Energy. Most people forget those last two, Department of Defense and Department of Energy, but they are predominant land managers as well of the federal estate. I'm going to clarify that in my study, I chose not to talk about tribal lands. These are the lands managed in trust for federally recognized tribes by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, largely because the mindset that I've taken in this particular book has a lot to do with recognizing tribal sovereignty. We understand that because the Department of Interior manages land for tribes, that land is held in trust, that tribal lands are not necessarily fully managed by tribes, and that is a limitation on tribal sovereignty. But I preferred to choose to recognize tribal governance of lands over federal governance. So this study does not necessarily include any tribal lands, except for perhaps the Duckwater Reservation and some of the colonies the Western Shoshone have in Nevada. So that aside, when you look at this map, you see essentially the federal estate. Yellow is BLM, green is Forest Service, dark green is Park Service, blue is military, the orange is DOE, and the pink stuff, that's the stuff that we're not talking about for reference. And as you consider this map, notice that the boundaries are very clear, they're crisp. We have separation between different pieces of management real estate. So in this administrative map of public lands, you know exactly where BLM jurisdiction ends and Forest Service jurisdiction begins, where Forest Service jurisdiction begins and National Parks or ends and National Park Service begins. So I want you to hold this image in your mind, because it turns out that location really matters. The location of this real estate, not just its location in the Great Basin, but the location of these administrative units, who's administering it, what pieces of real estate they're administering, and what the proximity of that land is with respect to any privately held land that, say, ranchers might own. And this is because there's a fundamental truth about land ownership. This is a statement by Richard T. Ely. He's one of the first land economists of the late 19th and early 20th century. I should also mention that he is a mentor of Frederick Jackson Turner. If you don't know who Turner is, he's the founder of Western history. Richard T. Ely wrote that the relation of one part of the Earth's surface is definitely and unalterably fixed to every other part. No two pieces of land are alike. No two pieces of land are alike. Similarly, Richard White mentioned in the early 90s that despite multiple use, land cannot be simultaneously parking lots, range, parking lots, and wilderness. So the principle is that land, one piece of real estate, has certain identities ascribed to it. And despite the fact that we might ascribe multiple identities, the land itself is this unique piece of real estate that may not be able to embrace those identities. So there's this tension then. Each piece of real estate is unique. You can try to do multiple things on it, but that may or may not be possible. Theoretically it is, but actually, maybe not. So for the ranchers that live in the central Great Basin, those that I studied, including Gracie and Uvalde, this map is directly out of my book, with the locations of the different ranchers I worked in, the proximity of their real estate, of their property, within the framework of public lands to other administrative structures that might prove problematic, like the Department of Defense real estate and the Department of Energy real estate. You see here represented the Nellis Test and Training Range and the former Nevada Test Site, which now has another name. That proximity means something very important. One of the things that I discovered that became sort of an absolute truth with regards to this study is that the Great Basin, in the mentality of the American public, is essentially a perceptive hole on the nation's mental map where seemingly inconsequential populations grapple with national interests and pressures. We think of the Great Basin as a place where nobody lives, where nothing happens, the big empty, a wasteland. We've been thinking about it this way since the early 1820s. This is John C. Fremont's map from the mid-1840s. The area that is sort of the square, that's the Great Basin, and it just says unexplored territory. It's also been called terra incognita, the unknown lands. It's the last place that was settled. It's the last place people think about. They just, for example, drive through between Salt Lake City and Reno. I'm sure you've done this. You drive through on I-80 and you don't give anything in between a second thought because there's nothing there and nobody lives there. But there are consequences to that thought process. This political cartoon is about Yucca Mountain. One of the reasons why Yucca Mountain is cited in the Great Basin is because it's an empty wasteland. Now, this is a satirical image of Harry Reid, that he himself is an empty wasteland. But the point is taken. The point is taken. And in case you're interested in doing any study on nuclear waste disposal, we don't talk about Yucca Mountain, and in 2010, the funding for the project got cut, but that doesn't mean that Yucca Mountain is dead. That doesn't mean that Yucca Mountain isn't going to happen, because the very attitude that allowed it to occur and be built in the first place continues and is going to ensure that at some point we do dump our high-level nuclear waste there, because that attitude of Nevada being a wasteland still persists. So what do you do with a wasteland? What do you do with land that nobody wants? All the public land laws of the 19th century broke down in the Great Basin. That's why there's so much public land. So what do? Something has to be done with the land. By the 1930s, this idea of multiple use, this concept where you can do multiple things with a piece of real estate, particularly public land, becomes the primary land management philosophy designed to put the Great Basin and other so-called wastelands into economic production. This is through the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. That law did not preclude settlement. In fact, you could still homestead on any grazing allotment throughout the 20th century, but it certainly guaranteed that the land would be utilized in some way. And the way it had been utilized was via ranchers like Grace and Uhalde's family, who had homesteaded a certain area and then gone on to utilize the proximate grazing range around their homesteaded property. And all the Taylor Grazing Act really did was codify that use. It ensured that those ranchers could use it in perpetuity as long as they met certain criteria. But after the Taylor Grazing Act, within a handful of decades, it became a cultural framework that justified federal oversight, allowed local residents access to surface resources, facilitated access to mineral resources, and ensured national interests that required a large land base could be pursued, like military testing. So by mid-century, by the middle of the 20th century, multiple use is sort of the way that we're managing. We're moving away from land disposal and privatization and into this framework that becomes very lucrative for the federal domain. And the federal government is going to allow all these different activities. Now, lest you get the wrong idea that this is some sort of hierarchical dictate from Washington, D.C., the way these particular legal structures and administrative policies come about that allow for multiple use are all being propelled and promoted by people who live in the Great Basin and these other national interests. And by the mid-1970s, multiple use ensured that our public lands, and I put our in quotes because I think we need to ask some questions about what that means, meant every American had a stake in the management of the federal domain. And that's sort of where we're at now, where we talk about our public lands, we talk about your investment in public lands, and we talk about taxpayer dollars. So to recap real quick, the public land laws that are non-disposal laws can be crafted into several different categories. And I've organized them this way, not in chronological order, but in conceptual order, because I think it bears realizing a couple things about these land laws. Some of them are meant for conservation, so to guarantee extractive industry. I could have put the Mining Act up here, but I didn't do so much research on the mining law of 1872. That it tends to be a subordinate, despite the fact that the Great Basin has a lot of mining operations. In terms of ranchers' lives, mining subordinates to their ranching operations. In fact, most ranchers engaged in mining to facilitate their purchase of real estate. So mining is a passing endeavor. It's not a primary endeavor for these individuals. So for our purposes, the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 and the Taylor Grazing Act allow resources like trees and grass forage to be utilized by giving certain individuals permission to go conduct extractive operations. We have a bunch of preservation acts that are designed to preserve natural resources in one way or another via scenic quality, some sort of amenity value, iconic landscapes, and cultural products that are unique. So the Antiquities Act of 1906, for example, preserves Mesa Verde. The Organic Act, which is the National Park Service's Origin Act of 1916, scenic landscapes, the Wilderness Act of 1964, the Free Roaming Wild Horses and Burros Act of 1971. If you didn't know, there's a law in the books that actually protects wild horses and burros. Don't forget about the burros. And the Endangered Species Act of 1973. But the vast majority, or the more interesting acts, at least in my book, and this is not all of them, this is just some of them, are actually about federal retention. The federal government has been retaining these lands throughout the 20th century. The Taylor Grazing Act was sort of a head nod towards that, or a head fake towards that. But every executive order, two are up here, that set aside military ranges was all about retention, retaining these lands in federal control so that we could conduct things like flight tests or nuclear tests or biological and chemical weapons tests. The Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act of 1960, that's the Forest Service's Multiple Use Act, the Classification and Multiple Use Act for the BLM in 1964, and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, the one that forms the core of the retention policy. But all those laws, all those legal structures actually create a very complicated landscape. And one of the other maps from my book is worth closely examining. Remember the map with the administrative boundaries? This one is a different kind of map of the same phenomenon. But instead of representing administrative boundaries, it represents use patterns. And look at the way in which grazing range, which is in white, overlaps with Forest Service, overlaps with Park Service, overlaps with wild horse management, overlaps with military testing. There's an area towards the bottom of the map. If you look at where the V, where Nevada comes together, just north of that, where those ranches were in that first map I showed you, that area is particularly problematic. And so one of the first things I had to come to grips with is this idea that the Great Basin is a big empty place where nothing happens and nobody lives is false, patently false. What's really true is that there are so many activities in the Great Basin that overlap so much, whether or not we realize it, that land management, and for the people that live there, this is especially true, has become highly problematic. And this might actually go a long way towards explaining what's going on in our time with some conversations surrounding public lands. So let me give you a little insight into the cultural framework that undergirds these legal structures, because I think this is actually where we can spend most of our time. Legal history is one way of understanding public lands management, but I'm actually a cultural and environmental historian, and that's the perspective I chose to take because I think this cultural framework goes straight underneath that legal framework. In fact, I think the cultural framework created the legal framework. So here's one thing to remember. Public, as in non-disposal land laws, codified activities that were already in existence. These laws, these land laws, are not the beginning of land management, of the land management process for a certain activity. They're just the codification of things that had already been happening. And if you understand that, then you might understand the position of ranchers a little bit better, who felt justified and validated by using the public domain for forage resources as the basis of their entire operations. Number two, the value of public lands is ascribed, and not inherent, and reflects our priorities. There is no single outcome for these public land laws. There's no single outcome for public lands management. It's a constructed process that can change over time. And that process, and the outcome of that process, reflects things that we value, not absolute truths. So what we take for granted, well, another way to put it is, there are things that we take for granted that we shouldn't be taking for granted. And when we hear people talk about their rights on these lands, maybe we should interrogate what they mean by that. Because technically, there's no inherent right to any of this. And number three, what I discovered most profoundly is that there's always a cost to public lands management, even if lands are managed for the greatest good. All of the laws that I listed were passed for the beneficence of the American public. The American public in general has benefited, and certain people in particular have benefited from the passage of the Taylor Grazing Act, from the passage of FLPMA, from the passage of all of those acts. But there's always a cost, and we forget that. Economists call these things externalities, and they don't really like to talk about them because externalities are inconveniences. But I'm actually most interested in the externalities. I'm most interested in the ways in which people do not benefit. In fact, one of the things that I ran across, this was probably the most profound discovery I made in my research. In 1950, one of the atomic scientists participating in a meeting about the establishment of the Continental Nuclear Test Site. This meeting was held in Los Alamos. It featured people like Enrico Fermi, a host of others, talking about, can we do this? Can we establish a Continental Nuclear Test Site? And Fermi made a statement that just sort of wrecked my mind for a little while. He said the size of the risk of conducting a nuclear tests on a continental test site was that 400 persons across 400 square miles in proximity to ground zero might be exposed. He said there's 1 person per square mile, that's the population density. They identified an area of about 400 square miles around the northeast corner of the test site where the prevailing winds blew. 400 people who lived there approximately, who might receive some contact with radioactive fallout. And then he said, and this is what he really meant, and I'm gonna paraphrase here so don't get the wrong idea, it's not a direct quote. He basically shrugs and said it's no big deal. In the context in which he said this cost was very small. And there was no reason, therefore, to not establish a continental nuclear test site and conduct nuclear testing in proximity to Las Vegas and these ranches, north of the test site. What struck me most about this is, one, he quantified it, so it shows some knowledge of the area. And 2, then, in that quantification, he used it as a rationalization for why we should just go ahead and have a test site. And we did. And the people that now live around the test site area, we call them downwinders, right? Because we know that they were exposed, and we know that they've suffered consequences. So that mentality about suppressing risk, about going into a situation and knowing that there's going to be some cost, but in the face of the height of the Cold War, the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the drive for the United States to have a nuclear arsenal, a well-established, proliferated nuclear arsenal, it was important that this test site be created. So for the greater good, we conducted nuclear tests in Nevada. But that doesn't mean that people didn't get hurt. That's why my book is titled the way it is, by the way. The Size of the Risk is a nod to Enrico Fermi. It's a nod to this idea that there are costs. But my point is that we shouldn't brush them off, because what happens when we refuse to acknowledge these costs is something that is an ongoing problem. This is because conflict actually happens. Whether or not these costs are small or big, their existence will create conflicts. And one of the major conflicts that comes out of the 1976 Public Lands Management Law, FLPMA, is the Sagebrush Rebellion. This is an illustration by Roy Doughty that was published in Newsweek magazine in September of 1979. It's called The Angry West. This became a very famous image that represents the tension inherent in Western land management and all the different ways public lands have been used. So you've got ranchers in Nevada, you have industry in northern Nevada and Utah. You can get a sense of what kinds of activities are going on. And the suggestion is that the West is burdened with this amount of public land and burdened with decisions that come out of Washington, D.C. about land management that negatively affect the people who live there. So here's some questions for you about the framing of land and how we can go forward in thinking about public lands management in a more useful way, perhaps. And this is a suggestion. I am one person who wrote a book, who crafted a study that gives you insight into public lands management, but there are others, and I would encourage you to go out and seek those different insights. But here are my conclusions. And it comes from this phrase from Richard T. Ely again, that idle land is never neutral. You can't just leave a piece of real estate in our economic system or legal system. You can't leave it unattended. You can't leave it unmanaged. You have to do something with it. It's because we've put property ownership as basically the basis for our national economy. Property is the only configuration we have for land. So somebody has to manage it and somebody has to pay for it. So one thing I suggest is understanding how land is framed. How can we help people see it? Because it has to have an identity. You have to tell people what it is. You can't just say, oh, here's a piece of real estate. Do whatever you want with it. This has been particularly problematic in the BLM, where outdoor recreationists will often intersect poorly with off-road vehicle users. Or rather, let's be more specific, hikers and horseback riders will have altercations with motorcyclists and quad riders. I personally had an interaction that was very interesting. I was riding my mountain bike outside of Las Vegas, technically not in the Great Basin, but BLM land, and somebody shot over my head, shot a gun over my head, because it turns out those trails are the same place where people, average users, go to target shoot. And you can do that, quarter mile off the road, off of a dirt road, anywhere on BLM land, you can target shoot. You got to do it responsibly. So I don't know that that was responsible. But those intersections happen unless we clearly identify what that land's identity is. We also have to learn to read the land. It's not just on administrative agencies to give the land an identity to tell us how we're going to use it. We have to learn how to read the landscape itself. And this goes back to the idea that the Great Basin is an empty place where nobody lives and nothing happens. When you see a barbed wire fence, that's a grazing allotment. When you see a no trespassing sign tacked to a building that looks completely abandoned, that's somebody's property. Might be federal property, might be private property. When you see a no entry sign and a little DOD symbol, that's a military range. We have to be a little bit better about learning to read these different ways of using the land, and not so cavalier maybe about just entering spaces where we're not supposed to be. Iowans know this better than anybody. In Iowa, there's virtually no public land. 1%, less than 1% of the state is owned by the federal government. So everybody knows, don't cross fields. That's somebody's property. The only public spaces that we get to use are parks. Personally, I find that very constricting. But in principle, public lands might not be the same, might not be any different. That there are appropriate places to do certain things, and we need to recognize we need to read the signs and signals and recognize what that is. We also have to engage with the land. I'm not sure, but how many of you have gone camping on public land? You can raise your hand. How many of you have done off-road vehicle use? Excellent, excellent, good. So you understand the land through experience. And we have to understand what our experiences are and what other people's experiences are. Everybody uses the land slightly differently. And one of the most important things about this understanding process, about this boots on the ground idea, is that when we engage with landscape, we actually write our stories into it. A gentleman named Keith Basso, who passed away recently, wrote a book called Wisdom Sits in Places. He was writing about native peoples in Arizona. But the principle of his book is simply that if you have interaction with land, you will create a memory and write a story onto that landscape. And ever after, when you go back there, you'll remember that story. That was the place where I ... And we do this with public land, we do it with our houses, we do it with our neighborhoods. We write stories into place. So understanding other people's stories is actually particularly important because it gives us insight into their personal connection, their emotional connection to these landscapes. And that connection cannot be invalidated by a law. People won't let it. That emotional component is very hard to navigate around, which means we don't get to just brush off and say, well, that's not the law, they should just get over it. I don't think it works like that. And then we need to recognize that how land is managed matters because management costs money. The Park Service had a program recently called Find Your Parks, because this is the year that it's the 100th anniversary of the Organic Act. So the National Park Service has been making a big deal about visiting parks. Find your park, that's the program. But in a Blog West article that Michael Childers wrote recently, he suggested that we should fund our parks. It's not find your park, it's fund it. Public lands management is the least funded federal program in so many ways. And you can think about it like your backyard. Do you mow your backyard? Do you take care of it? Or do you dump trash in it? You probably don't dump trash in it because you have to live with that trash. This is the same for our public lands. You have to fund them. You have to fund them responsibly and you have to fund them actively to do proactive things, maybe not dumping trash in them. This is one of the graphics from my book that I was very fascinated with. This was the flyer that promoted Great Basin National Park, which in the 60s was not created. It was not created until the 1980s. And the story in my book is about its not creation, which is very interesting. But the gist of this flyer is that these lands have economic meaning. They really do. That's part of how we structure our land as property. So understanding that funding structure, national parks are the easiest way, but we should also pay attention to that BLM land. That's important if land is going to function in our economy. Either that or we change our economy itself. So what's the application for this? In the last 2 years, 3 years, we've undergone some interesting dialogue, or had some interesting dialogue regarding public lands management. Cliven Bundy in Bunkerville partnered with patriot groups to defend his property. I am not a fan of defending Bundy, but I wrote an article for Blog West about how we should understand Bundy and his position. Cliven Bundy did not just create ideas of conspiracy out of the ether. They come from somewhere. They come from his background with public lands. They come from the way his family integrated themselves into the Nevada landscape. They're not from Nevada, by the way. They're from the Arizona Strip, a town called Bundyville, it turns out. And their transition from Bundyville to Bunkerville had a lot to do with their loss of their homes, the loss of their homestead on the Arizona Strip. Malheur Wildlife Refuge is another story. Again, we see ranchers and patriot groups talking about their rights, talking about their freedoms. This relationship between ranchers and patriot groups is very interesting, something that I would like to get to the bottom of in my second book. I'm not sure I understand it at all right now, but what this relationship has done is escalate the rhetoric and escalate the violence. And if public lands management is becoming violent, then it means that federal officials, and we all know people who work for the BLM, the Forest Service, the Park Service, they can't go to work. They can't go to work without receiving some threats on a regular basis, either daily, monthly, or weekly. So maybe there's a way to scale down the violence. Maybe there's a way to help people understand how to appropriately interact with lands. This is from Recapture Canyon. The Bundys, again, were involved in a particular protest ride meant to assert control over a series of roads that the BLM had closed for the purposes of riding off-road vehicles. Now, that protest ride, did a lot of damage to the landscape. And there's been a lot of vandalism to cultural resources that have pitted local residents against local tribes. That's also problematic. But maybe there's a way to understand these different positions, because the riders in Recapture Canyon were very concerned that their ability to ride their vehicles where they had always ridden their vehicles, to engage with their stories, so to speak, was being violated. And maybe that's what they meant by their rights. And then finally, we have what's going on with Barriers National Monument down south in the state. The tribe, several tribes actually, are very interested in creating a situation where public lands adjacent to their reservations are managed under a co-management structure with the federal government. From their perspective, this is an assertion of their sovereignty, and considering how much these tribes have lost, it bears considering how their stories are going to be respected on this landscape. But of course, there's opposition with local residents who have their stories in place. And so understanding these frameworks is going to be key to understanding how to grapple with barriers going forward. We don't know if it's going to be a national monument. That remains on the table. I guess we'll have to see. So I hope that you found some of this helpful. I hope I've given you sort of a way to think about public lands management that's a little different than what you're used to. But to further the conversation, let me ask you if you have any questions. Yes, sir.
Last few slides, I was wondering the whole time you would get there, but there's one more I was hoping you would get to.
Okay, what would that be?
The contest right now for control, the Utah Public Lands lawsuit that might materialize the Congressional Public Lands Initiative, all these arguments over control. I don't know if the research has anything to say to those.
this is one of the things I'm contending with my new book on the Sagebrush Rebellion, where I look at all the public lands transfer proposals that have come about as part of the Sagebrush Rebellion. What I have discovered so far along those lines is that it bears questioning our assumptions about who manages the land. So let me clarify. I'm not a proponent one way or the other, but I'm intrigued about the way in which different groups are making assumptions about either the federal government being the best land manager, or the state being the best land manager, or private citizens being the best land manager. The law, I need to look a little closer at the law, so forgive me as I'm going to generalize a little bit. The law is, as proposed, is pushing more authority into the hands of the state. Is that correct?
State law. There's also bishops working on law in Congress.
Okay. Yes, it's the congressional law that I'm thinking about, the one that they're doing hearings about right now. We should probably, if we're going to make this renewed commitment to public lands, we have to question, those people who are attached to federal management have to question why. Why is the federal government the best manager of these lands? Why would the states be a better manager? We have to go back to I think the first principles of land management itself, because the assumption we've been making throughout the 20th century is that the federal government is the best land manager. And if you look at those laws, having codified things that were already in existence, the federal government is a default manager. That's what happened as this land disposal process fell apart. And as of 1976, the federal government is no longer in the business of disposing of land. That was an agreed upon concept in the 70s. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the federal government is the best manager. And I'm interested in going back and really delving into what those assumptions are. And the same is true for state land. Utah actually happens to be in the best position, or rather has been highlighted by historians and land policy managers as being the state that manages land the best. Utah lands make good revenue. But does that mean that Utah would be a better manager of these lands? Don't know. It could be a matter of scale. But going back and questioning those assumptions, I think, is going to be key. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so I had a couple of questions. You showed a cartoon earlier that showed just sort of the conflict that the West faces with land appropriation. My question is, why do you feel like that challenge, and I guess maybe correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems like that challenge has been sort of unique to the western part of this country. Why is that? Is that because it's perceived as waste? Is it because it's sort of this unknown? And then my second question, kind of piggybacking on that, is where do you see the trends going? Are we heading towards more state ownership, federal, private? Is there a way that this thing's heading?
Okay, so to your first question, the tacit assumption that this is the leftover land, I think, has undergirded all of the decisions going forward.
Okay.
So everything is sort of is a de facto position. In lieu of disposal, this has happened. In lieu of privatization, this has happened. The commitment that the federal government made in 1976 to retain these lands represents a new assumption. But I think we've been in a transition since. We're still struggling, and realize between 1970 and when the Public Land Law Review Commission gave its report, 1/3 of the nation's land, that recommended that the federal government retain land in perpetuity, all the way through our current time, it's been a generation and a half. So rather than things happening overnight, we're going to go through this transition process. And then the outcome, to your second question, I don't know. I don't know what direction we're going. And I don't think that who sits in the Oval Office is going to matter much with that decision. I think that Western states, because residents of these states live with the reality of public lands, are going to weigh in via their federal officials and push the conversation one way or the other.
You didn't mention this in your presentation, but is this an issue that falls on party lines at all, or is it pretty, red versus blue? Does that matter, or is it just kind of up to the individual?
Historically, especially in the Great Basin, public lands management issues have never fallen on party lines. It has never been a red or blue issue. It's always been an issue of constituencies. So the fracture that I see in the West most profoundly are districts that are very urban and have a certain set of interests. And these tend to be comprised of recreationists who go out and camp, and they're interested in the amenity value as opposed to the economic value. Because let's be honest, I personally do not like camping where there's a pile of cow manure. I don't like that. That sort of ruins my wilderness experience. Residents of rural counties tend to move in a different direction. Sometimes you can construe that along party lines. R. Gregor Macaulay, in a famous book called Federal Land Western Anger, he's a public policy guy up at University of Wyoming. He construed it along traditional conservation lines versus environmentalist lines. And sometimes that's a red and blue split, but I actually think there's another split that has more to do with not just urban-rural or environmentalist or conservationist, but has a lot more to do with how you live with public lands. And I'm looking particularly at places like Tonopah, Nevada, and Ely and Elko. These are places that Tonopah, maybe if you've been there, maybe we can construe that as a tiny little town. But it's only recently become a tiny little town. It used to be a big booming mining town. But places like Elko and Ely and Delta, they like to think of themselves as rural. But population-wise, not so much. Not really. I learned a lot about rural configurations in Iowa. Iowa fancies itself a very rural agrarian state, despite the fact that agriculture comprises less than half of the Iowa economy, and the fact that most Iowans don't live in the Census Bureau's classification of a rural town. And let's be honest, if you can drive 5 miles to the next town, are you really in a rural area, or is that just like one great patchwork of suburbs, right? So it bears thinking a little bit more deeply about these fractures. And then in the back, go ahead.
How should Mustangs be managed on public lands?
Also a very good question. The current management structure for wild horses and burros on public lands is probably in the worst state it's ever been since the passage of the law, and maybe before. I don't know how it's going to go, but I can tell you that the fracture between wild horse advocates and the BLM, the people who have to actually manage the horses, has reached an impasse, and I don't know if it's surmountable. And this has nothing to do with politics. It has everything to do with conceptualizations of animal rights. The position, and I do have a position on this because I've been a Mustang owner, the position that most people have on wild horses who don't live with them is an abstract position. It takes the animal and abstracts it out of the landscape and abstracts it out of its animalness. So wild horses become an idea and something that you love to think about, but not something that's an actual reality. And as a former horse owner and a former Mustang owner, I lived with that reality. And the questions I see advocates in particular not asking are about what's best for the horses. Horses require intensive management. They always have. They're livestock, and forgive me if I'm stepping on any toes, but there's no species of wild horse on the North American continent, according to scientists. So these are reintroduced domestic species that have gone feral. Their reproduction rate is around 20% a year. Their reproduction doesn't stop in times of scarcity. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that when the population is doubling every so many years? That requires intensive management, and I think we've forgotten that. The best solution I've heard so far coming out of the BLM is the PZP drug, the fertility drug, but no one wants to fund it. And the worst solution I've seen is we just need to store more of them. In the Midwest, we have a number of wild horse sanctuaries, and I've seen them. And I'm not sure that's better than roundups, and I'm not sure that's better than roundups and slaughter. So look for the one thing coming down the pipeline, which is a new discussion on wild horse slaughter. That's going to cause a lot of controversy, but I think it's coming. And then back here.
I guess my question has to do with the Endangered Species Act and safe grouse habitat. I'm from Idaho, and I know that they talked about cutting grazing
There are two acts that proliferate across public lands regardless of agency. One is the Endangered Species Act. The other one is the National Environmental Policy Act, where we get this EIS, Environmental Impact Statement review process. The Endangered Species Act, James Skillen has called, in a book called Federal Ecosystem Management, which you might be interested in, he's called that a substantive act that requires certain things to be done. So until that law is altered or changed in any way, endangered species will get priority over cattle. And ranchers are then under an obligation to adapt to that. The resistance that ranchers have over making that happen has a lot to do with them being left out of conversations. I don't know that ranchers are ever going to be happy with making those concessions, but there's certainly a cooperative management structure that can be created that would allow them to be a greater part of the conversation and even allow them to be involved in the conservation of sage grouse. Because one thing we do know is that when these targeted species are looked after and when their habitat is facilitated, the ripple effect is very good. The wolves in Yellowstone has been the classic example of what happens when you foster a healthy ecosystem that includes things that we don't want, things that seem like it's not a priority. When scientists the scientist in particular named Doug Smith reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, it fixed so many problems. The cascading effect, and there's some debate as to how prolific this cascading effect was, but the general idea is that wolf reintroduction had a cascade effect on the entire environment. So riparian areas got a little bit better, which seems strange. What do wolves have to do with riparian areas? Well, there was this chain reaction of wolf predation on species that interacted with riparian areas, and it suppressed the buffalo population and the elk population. They're not too sure to what extent yet. It's currently being studied. So maybe there's a cascading effect with sage grouse. Maybe there's new information we can research or new ways we can understand the ripple effect of sage grouse on these landscapes. You look like you have a follow-up question, though. Are you sure? If you disagree, you can bring it.
No, I mean, I plan on ranching, so it affects my livelihood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Within the BLM in particular, this cooperative management structure is going to be hard fought and hard won by ranchers, but I think you should take heart. I think that that's the only way it can be done. You have to have a seat at the table. Go ahead.
What has the federal government done and like for those downwinders that you talked about that were affected by computer testing, what has the government done to make amends there?
There's never been an official apology for exposing American citizens to radioactive fallout. And we always talk about the downwinders, but this entire country was exposed, as were other countries. In 1990, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And what that did was allow for people who felt they had suffered from exposure to radioactive fallout to apply for compensation. And there's a process by which you can declare your illness. There's a set of illnesses that are described under the Act that are eligible to receive compensation, and then you demonstrate your relationship to fallout clouds. It's complicated, it's not easy, and I know many downwinders who have not gotten compensation, but I also know many who have. Gracie and Uhalde, my example from the talk here, received, I can't remember the dollar amount, but a good chunk of money to cover his expenses for prostate cancer. So he ended up having a bout with cancer as a result of his exposure. Yes?
From what I understand, one of the reasons the mayor's here is the sore point to sail on, especially in landing, is people remember the actions of BLM and FBI and something called Operation Cerberus Action. Right, Cerberus Action.
Just a little bit.
I just wondered if you had.
Can I get you to clarify
Okay, so
the action?
I intern for BLM, so
Mhm.
Cerberus Action was multi-state action between the BLM and the FBI to identify people who were engaged in heavy-duty looting on federal land. and his wife were facing prison terms. And then actually 2 other people committed suicide as well. And so it's kind of a sore point between the residents of Landing, because he was one of the only doctors in town, and he was kind of a respected member of the church.
Yeah.
So there was a real disconnect between the local residents who didn't really view it as wrong to go, go look for pots and sell them. They didn't really see that as that big of a crime and the actions of the government. So I don't know if you guys have dealt with that.
Only peripherally. But I do remember the case of the doctor. And it bears, so some of this process that I've been talking about is applicable to this particular situation. This idea that individuals throughout the 20th century, late 19th and 20th century, we didn't call it looting, we called it preserving. This is what people did in areas that had a lot of native artifacts. They would go collect. In fact, I think that might be the best word. It's collecting. But since at least the Indian New Deal in the 1930s, that would be the earliest I would point to, but most certainly since the Native American Self-Determination Act of the mid-70s, that kind of action has been frowned upon, and now it's just outright illegal, right?
Yeah, I'm an archaeology major, and I can tell you when it isn't professionally done, the integrity of the site is severely damaged.
Of course. Of course. Not only that, there's this other component that is about disrespect, disrespecting the ancestors of these tribes, disrespecting tribes themselves.
They often don't consider those sites to be abandoned.
Correct. Correct. The tribes do not consider those sites to be abandoned. Okay, so in terms of this, of understanding stories in landscape and transitions, this doctor sits within this transition area. This is something they had done. They chose to continue to do it. It was deemed wrong, in their opinion, in their lifetime. And I don't know much about his story, but it seems to me the suicide was not about guilt so much as it was about, I don't see a way forward. Is that correct? And I don't want to go to jail. Helping people through this transition. And the BLM, the officials from the BLM, one thing you have to remember about, and you probably know this better than anybody, but one thing you have to remember about government officials is they have mandates that they follow. They don't get to decide necessarily what they enforce and what they don't. These mandates come down the hierarchical chain from directors, from secretaries. Their job is just to implement them. They can control how, but eliminating looting was a mandate that came down. And in some ways, we're responsible for that. We're the ones that are driving these mandates. Because when that law passed, you can take it to NAGPRA, you can take it to the Self-Determination Act. Our congressman passed that, signed off. It's something that we as the American public approved. So how then do you help people through that transition? You know, maybe it's about enforcing things differently. Maybe the BLM could have done things different, but we're the ones that are responsible for that law. So where does that leave our understanding of how these laws come into place? If you had known that this person was going to do that, would you have allowed passage of that law? Was that law the right thing to do? Or is this one of those costs that I talked about? Is this doctor's death the size of the risk of that particular law? Does that make sense? There's no easy answer. The one thing I'm most concerned about in my work, and this will help clarify probably a fundamental orientation I have, because we all carry around implicit biases. I don't like it when politicians, I don't like it when individuals rationalize outcomes. There are reasons why we have certain outcomes, but to justify them based on, well, it's just the law, or they knew they shouldn't be doing that. That's not good enough. You have to go a little deeper and a little further. So it's hard to know what these costs might be. It's hard to know what these externalities might be, but we have to do a better job of keeping our eye on them. And I think that's what you're suggesting, is in this complicated situation with the BLM and this particular doctor, Somebody lost their life. Somebody took their own life. So how can we prevent that from happening again? He's a cost. Yeah.
I was just wondering what the most influential books have been for you as research. What did you recommend?
That's a good question. Last night I was talking with Bill Handley about John McPhee, Annals of the Former World, specifically Basin and Range. I am a long-standing fan of Rebecca Solnit, not necessarily because of her opinions, but because of her craft. She's one of the best writers you could ever hope to read. And I really have loved Dan Flores's work about landscape. So works that use good writing, good wordcraft, works that put you into the landscape, and works that help make visible what is invisible. Those are the things I like the best.
And what's your book called?
The Size of the Risk.
In the interviews we had with ranchers and things, did they, I guess, did you get a sense that they would be, like, not would be willing, but were interested in conservation and things like that? Because I know, having worked in sagebrush ecosystems, they're not exactly the most profitable ecosystem. They're rather fragile ecosystems. I guess, do you feel that ranchers see this and they're not just kind of being selfish, like they just want to get their chunk of use out of the land, or is it that their feelings are the same as federal officials' management feelings? They're just not talking. They want to go the same direction, but no one's communicating, so everyone thinks everyone else is on the wrong side.
Every rancher that I've talked to, especially Gracie and Uvalde, is interested in conservation. They're interested in doing their business better. What they don't like at large is how oftentimes federal officials don't recognize their expertise and their experience doing what they do. And because they're not scientists, not recognized officially as scientists, they often don't get seats at these tables. They don't get to be in the room when these decisions are made, because these are scientific decisions a lot of times, made by biologists. The ranchers in the Great Basin, very few of them are wealthy. They do what they do, and this is Gracie and Uvalde in particular. They do what they do because they like it, and because it's a way for them to live on the property that their grandfather or great-grandfather homesteaded and earn a living. And when Gracian said, I see this not being able to continue, but there may be a way forward, one of the things he was talking about was creating a system that allows better participation and allowing different forms of expertise to dialogue with each other. This is why he sat on the Nevada Wild Horse Commission. He's worked closely with the BLM. Some ranchers, like the Fellini's family, is one set of ranchers I talk about. They are so burned by the BLM that I don't think they'll ever sit in the room with any government official ever again. And they've been in ongoing litigation since the 90s, if I'm remembering correctly. For each rancher, it's going to be different, but federal officials can do a better job of creating a way in which these people can be in the room. I don't think Gracian would say, I just want to run as many cattle or sheep on my ranch as I can. He's actually interested in something that more closely approximates sufficiency. There's a book by Thomas Princeton, a scholar of many disciplines, to the extent that I don't actually know what his home discipline is. He writes a book called The Logic of Sufficiency, where he details this idea that for most people, enough, this threshold of what is enough, is where they want to be. And that could be a different kind of approach to multiple use. Multiple use in the past has been predicated on maximization, which pushes one use against another. This is sort of baked into the cake with our property structure. If we say that one blade of grass can be either eaten by a cow-calf pair or eaten by a horse or by something else, then we've automatically created a zero-sum game. But in a framework that utilizes sufficiency, we take that zero sum potentially out of the equation. So there's something left over, because everybody, it's more like the minimum as opposed to the maximum. Does that make sense? I don't know how many land managers are talking about sufficiency, but it'd be an interesting, one of the things I'm interested in is working with land managers more and introducing that idea as part of co-management. What was that? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I just had a comment on what you were saying, because if a ranch wants to be profitable in the long run, like they can't run their ground into they can't like overgraze, or else you would run out of grass. And what do you have, right? One thing that I hear is ranchers aren't in the business of cattle; they're in the business of grass. Because without grass, you have no cattle. And so, if you're a good rancher, you're all about conservation. You want to sustain the land so you can sustain your operation.
There are two ranching groups that sort of model this idea. One is called the Blackfeet Challenge, and it's not just about ranching. It's more about an urban landscape up in Montana that has utilized the idea of a working ranch to create open space. And then the Malpai Borderlands group in southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. The Malpai group has been held up as sort of the epitome of collaborative or cooperative management, depends on how you want to describe it. But they provide good models. I will say that, though, with the caveat that in both cases, there is a large mix of private land in with public land. And so there's incentive for everybody to sit down and work together to make a seamlessly run landscape as opposed to a fractured one. But in areas of the Great Basin where the monopoly is in the federal domain, there might have to be a different solution because we still think nobody lives there and nothing happens. Thank you for your time. You've been a good audience.